kind of nails down the cultural moment in the Heart Sutra was written better than pretty much anyone I've ever read. It's fascinating, actually. Yeah, it's definitely worth reading. Excellent. Fantastic. Great. Yeah. Well, let's now that the gear is working, let's sit for a bit. And while we're sitting, I'll probably give a little teensy bit of instruction and then read Dogen's Fukanza Zengi. So I would say, in whatever posture you're in, bring your body upright and try and lean into a sense of sitting energetically, in the sense of with a kind of energetic engagement with the body, right? And also relaxed, right? So there's no straining. The body is basically kind of a soft artifact of evolution, right? It has curves, it has places where you make an effort, and it has places where you don't make an effort, and so on and so forth. And all of those should be kind of relaxed, right? The idea is to be sitting upright largely because you're balanced left and right, forward and back, and all of the joints that make up your body, bottom to top, are also balanced in some way. Your neck joint, your waist and hips are balanced left and right, forward and back. Right? And let's get started, and then in a bit I'll read. Dogen doesn't say this. He just says, keep your eyes open. But it's worth noticing something about the eyes as long as we're here. If your eyes are open and relaxed and kind of looking at the floor in front of you, there's still a bunch of questions about, one, how open they should be and what your gaze should be taking in. And without spending too much effort on it, it's worth noting that if you allow your gaze to relax and your eyes to be sort of normally open, and then also without having your eyes jump around, which they normally want to do, they want to do these things called saccades, which is that they leap from one view to another every few seconds, right? Rather than, so sort of see if you can relax that, but at the same time, open your field of view so it takes in as much of the periphery as possible. And see what effect that has on the quality of mind and the quality of your attention. The way is basically perfect and all-pervading. How could it be contingent upon practice and realization? The Dharma vehicle is free and untrammeled. What need is there for concentrated effort? Indeed, the whole body is far beyond the world's dust. Who could believe in a means to brush it clean? It's never apart from one, right where one is. What's the use of going off here and there to practice? And yet, if there's the slightest discrepancy, the way is as distant as heaven from earth. If the least like or dislike arises, the mind is lost in confusion. Suppose one gauges pride of one's understanding and inflates one's own enlightenment, glimpsing the wisdom that runs through all things, attaining the way and clarifying the mind, raising an aspiration to escalade the very sky. Is making the initial partial excursions about the frontiers, but is still somewhat deficient in the vital way of total emancipation. Need I mention the Buddha, who was possessed of inborn knowledge? The influence of his 6 years of upright sitting is noticeable still. Or Bodhidharma's transmission of the mind seal. The fame of his 9 years of wall sitting is celebrated to this day. Since this was the case with the saints of old, how can we today dispense with negotiation of the way? You should therefore cease from practice based on intellectual understanding, pursuing words and following after speech, and learn the backward step that turns your light inwardly to illuminate yourself. Body and mind of themselves will drop away, and your original face will be manifest. If you want to attain suchness, you should practice suchness without delay. For Sanzen, a quiet room is suitable. Eat and drink moderately. Cast aside all involvements in seesaw affairs. In other words, don't take voicemails. Do not think good or bad. Do not administer pros and cons. Cease all movements of the conscious mind, the gauging of all thoughts and views. Have no designs on becoming a Buddha. Sanzen has nothing to do with sitting or lying down. At the site of your regular sitting, spread out thick matting and place a cushion above it. Sit either in the full lotus or half lotus posture. In the full lotus position, you first place your right foot on your left thigh and then your left foot on your right thigh. In the half lotus, you simply press your left foot against your right thigh. You should have your robes and belt loosely bound and arranged in order. Then place your right hand on your left leg and your left palm facing upward on your right palm, thumb tips touching. Thus, sit upright in correct bodily posture, neither leaning left nor right, neither inclining forward nor backward. Be sure your ears are on a plane with your shoulders and your nose in line with your navel. Place your tongue against the front roof of your mouth with your teeth and lips both shut. Your eyes should always remain open, and you should breathe gently through your nose. Once you've adjusted your posture, take a deep breath. Inhale and exhale. Rock your body right and left, and settle into a steady, immovable sitting position. Think of not thinking. How do you think of not thinking? Non-thinking. This in itself is the essential art of Zazen. The Zazen I speak of is not learning meditation. It's simply the Dharma gate of repose and bliss, the practice realization of totally culminated enlightenment. It's the manifestation of ultimate reality. Traps and snares can never reach it. Once its heart is grasped, you're like a dragon gaining the water, like a tiger taking to the mountains. For you must know that just there, the right Dharma is manifesting itself, and that from the first, dullness and distraction are struck aside. When you arise from sitting, move slowly and quietly, calmly and deliberately. Do not rise suddenly or abruptly. In surveying the past, we find that transcendence of both unenlightenment and enlightenment and dying, while either sitting or standing, have all depended entirely upon the strength of Zazen. In addition, the bringing about of enlightenment by the opportunity provided by a finger, a banner, a needle, or a mallet, and the effecting of realization with the aid of a hasu, a fist, a staff, or a shout cannot be fully understood by discriminative thinking. Indeed, it cannot be fully known by the practicing or realizing of supernatural powers. And it must be deportment beyond hearing and seeing. Is it not a principle that's prior to knowledge and perception? This being the case, intelligence or lack of it doesn't matter. Between the dull and the sharp-witted, there's no distinction. If you concentrate your efforts single-mindedly, that in itself is negotiating the way. Practice realization is naturally undefiled. Going forward in practice is a matter of everydayness. In general, this world and other worlds as well, both in India and China, equally hold the Buddha seal, and overall prevails the character of this school, which is simply devotion to sitting, total engagement in immovable sitting. Although it's said that there are as many minds as there are persons, still they all negotiate the way solely in Zazen. Why leave behind the seat that exists in your home and go off aimlessly to the dusty realms of other lands? If you make one misstep, you go astray from the way directly before you. You've gained the opportunity of human form, the pivotal opportunity of human form. Do not use your time in vain. You are maintaining the essential working of the Buddha way. Who would take wasteful delight in the spark from the flintstone? Besides, form and substance are like the dew on the grass, destiny like the dart of lightning, emptied in an instant, vanished in a flash. Please, followers of Zen, long accustomed to groping for the elephant, do not be suspicious of the true dragon. Devote your energies to a way that directly indicates the absolute. Revere the person of complete attainment who's beyond all human agency. Gain accord with the enlightenment of the Buddhas, succeed to the legitimate lineage of the ancestors, samadhi. Constantly perform in such a manner, and you are assured of being a person such as they. Your treasure store will open of itself, and you will use it at will. So now we can do that. So before we move on, let's do a little breathing and stretching for fun, because otherwise we might be sitting in some sort of posture for an hour and a half, which might be a bit much. So first of all, let's talk about the breathing part a little bit. So anybody who's done yoga will be familiar with this, I think. And probably anyone who's done any martial arts as well, right? But because all of this stuff came from the same place, let's be clear. But if you sitting here in your upright sitting posture, you can become aware of this place, kind of, in Chinese, I think it's Dantian or something like that, right? In Japanese, it's the Hara, right? It's sort of down below your navel in the middle of your body. There's a kind of area that is really, it's kind of the very bottom of your breathing apparatus when you come right down to it. And you can attend to that and put a little tension there by just tightening your lower stomach muscles, leaving your upper stomach muscles in there, the muscles around your sternum relaxed, but tightening the muscles down here a little bit, and also pulling up and tightening a little bit the muscles of your pelvic floor. So with that kind of tension, a modest amount of tension in your hara, take a breath in, and then to do a long, slow breath out. So, and I'm going to exaggerate it, but it'll sound, and nobody needs to exaggerate it like this, but it'll be like this, right? So, and then pause. And when your diaphragm says so, just let go of the tension. Keep your attention in your hara. Keep your energy in your hara, and allow the breath to come in and fill your body. So let's do that about 3 more times, just at your own rate. And if you end up doing it more than 3, it's fine. But let's just breathe a few times together like that. So. You'll notice the in-breath is much shorter than the out-breath. Okay, on your next out breath, so I'll give the instructions, and then on your next out breath, put your right hand on your left knee, sit up straight, and on the next out breath, wrap your left arm around behind your back and twist to the left, looking over your left shoulder. So. Release. Take a nice deep breath, and then on the next out breath, turn towards your left knee and bend over your left knee, keeping your back straight. You can support yourself with your hands if you like. See if you can, even when you're doing these stretches, see if you can stay with your breath. All right, straighten up. Just rest here for a minute and breathe. Not a minute, for a few breaths. And then on the next out breath, place your left palm on your right knee. Straighten your back. And on the next out breath, twist to the right and look over your right shoulder. Wrap your right arm around behind your back. Okay, release on the in-breath. And on the out-breath, straighten your back, square yourself over your right knee and bend over your right knee. See if you can go deeper with each breath, but don't overdo it. All right, straighten up. So, does anybody have any questions about anything that's happened up until this moment? And that can include your entire life or just this this class. In particular, anything about Dogen's instructions for Zazen from the 13th century, or any of the stuff I said, anything that came up while you were sitting, anything that came up during the stretching exercises, any of that stuff. What do you think? Yeah, go ahead.
Right in the first couple sentences of the instructions, Dogen implies, or pretty much straight out says, that to do the practice is to attain the state, or so it seems. But then on the next sentence he says, and yet if you make a single misstep, you're going to tumble to the ground.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is a major anomaly. Doesn't segue, where it seems to imply that it's easy, and yet you can really mess it up if you get it wrong. So is there an attainment, or is it a sitting? It's hard for me to understand what the goal is.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really excellent question. I mean, let me read the first part of the Fukan-sa Zengi again, because it's worth, he's like all manifesto-like documents, he's trying to really pack it in there, right? So he says, the way is basically perfect and all pervading. Okay, so in other words, the way, capital W, is never, we're never far from it, really, right? And it's perfect just the way it is. It's like Suzuki Roshi said, you're perfect just as you are. And then a little later he says, but there's always room for improvement. That's in some ways what Dogen is saying here too, right? And that's not surprising, since in some ways Suzuki Roshi was just channeling Dogen for a bunch of hippies and beatniks in San Francisco back in the and San Francisco and Palo Alto back in the late 50s and early 60s. Right? But be that as it may, right? The way is basically perfect and all pervading. How could it be contingent upon practice and realization? In other words, why would the way of living in harmony with the world and living with comfort and skill in the presence of the human condition, right? Why should it be contingent upon practice and realization? Why should you have to do anything, he's saying. And he's saying the Dharma vehicle is free and untrammeled. When he's saying Dharma vehicle, he means your body, right? And by extension also the mind, right? Your body and mind are free and untrammeled. Why do you need to make any kind of concentrated effort whatsoever? And in other words, why would you need to sit zazen? Right? And he says the whole body is far beyond the world's dust. Who could believe in a means to brush it clean? That's a direct reference to this kind of famous story of the ordination of the Sixth Ancestor. You heard this story? I'll briefly tell the story. It's good. So the Sixth Ancestor was supposedly this illiterate woodcutter from a what's now a sort of what do they call them in China? They're like ethnic enclaves or something like that in the South, right? Where there's still these enclaves of people that speak Dai and stuff like that, right? And so he was an illiterate woodcutter from the South, and he was hanging around the market one day and he heard somebody chanting the Diamond Sutra, and he's like, wow, I think I get this. And so he went off to a monastery, and the Fifth Ancestor's monastery, and the guy immediately said, why would we admit you? You're a country bumpkin, right? And he was like, hey, the Diamond Sutra says everybody can wake up. Why not this country bumpkin? And so the teacher was like, okay. Then he admitted him and sent him to work as the rice cook. And he was there for a while. And the Fifth Ancestor was trying to retire. And he was like, I need to appoint a successor. And this is the first reason why this story is probably a fabrication. And he says, here's what I'll do. I'll run a poetry contest. and the person who writes the best poem can be my successor. And everybody in the assembly, all the monks, said, oh, the guy that's currently the Shuso, I was talking about this before, right? The head seat, right? The guy with the extra ceremonial duties and so on. He's really the best poet, and also he's the most accomplished of us. Why don't we just not write anything, let him write one, and then he'll be appointed and everything will be great, right? And so that's what happened. And he wrote this poem, and the poem essentially goes like this. He says, your mind is a bright mirror and your body is the stand that holds the bright mirror. And every day you brush the dust off so that you can see clearly, right? That's sort of that was his poem. Obviously it was in early Tang Dynasty Chinese, but that's sort of what it said, right? And the Fifth Ancestor was like, yeah, great, awesome, right? And then somebody reported this to Huineng, the future sixth ancestor working in the kitchen, and Huineng thought for a second, and he said, I don't know how to write, but I think I could do a better poem. Will you write it for me? And the guy was like, okay, fine. And he said, how about if you write it for me on the wall outside the abbot's quarters? And so the abbot comes out in the morning, and he's like, he looks at the wall and he's like, okay, this is a guy, and I have this theory, I know who it is. So he invites Huineng into his the abbot's room and says, did you write that poem? And Huineng goes, yeah, I wrote it. He goes, okay, you're my successor. But here's the deal, right? If you, the crucial part is I forgot to tell you what the poem was. His poem was, there's no mirror and no stand. Where's the dust and the settle, basically? And so the fifth ancestor says, everyone's going to be really jealous and they might even kill you. So here's what you got to do. Take my robe, take my bowl, put them in your backpack and get the hell out of town. And he ran off to the south and did all this stuff, like worked in an organization that captures wild birds and sells them to rich people, and did all this other strange stuff. And then in the end, he came out as the fifth ancestor's successor and was and got a temple and essentially founded the Zen school, right? Even though Bodhidharma sort of kicked it off, according to the literature. The definitive text, the founding text of the Zen school is probably his document called the Platform Sutra, which was not written by him. It was written by his Dharma grandson. But anyway, so that thing about the whole body is far beyond the world's dust, who can believe in a means to brush it clean, that's a reference to that. So in other words, you don't need to be polishing the mirror, okay? He says, it's never apart from one, right where one is. What's the use of going off here and there to practice? Okay, so that's the question, right? And that is essentially the question that got Dogen into trouble in the first place. Basically, he was a ward of the imperial court. His mom died. His dad died when he was quite young. His mom died when he was 7 or something like that. And after a while, they're like, well, you can't just keep him around here. Let's send him off to a monastery. And so they sent him off to this monastery on Mount Hiei outside of Kyoto, which you probably at least saw the mountain when you're in Kyoto, right? And he studied diligently, and he got ordained as a priest and so on and so forth. But he was constantly bugging people with this question, which is that all of the documents, the Buddhist documents that I'm reading, say that essentially the way is perfect, basically perfect and all pervading, right? In other words, everybody is fully endowed with essentially the mind of the Buddha, right? And yet, when you look at the records of the great teachers, the Buddha, Bodhidharma, etc., you realize that they spent all this time practicing, right? So what's the deal, right? And so he said he starts the explanation by saying this is all true. In other words, we're all fundamentally Buddhas, and yet, because of the way we're built, we're constantly throwing up preferences, categorical schemes that divide the world, including most basically divide the world between self and other, right? And we're making a mess with that. And he's basically, the way he says it, he says, and yet, if there's the slightest discrepancy, the way is as distant as heaven from earth. In other words, if we exercise this this dualistic preferential thinking, we lose track of our essential Buddha nature, right? And if the least like or dislike arises, the mind is lost in confusion. So suppose, and then he says, let's say you're actually studying Buddhism, and you're pretty scholarly and good at it, and I love the way he says this. He says, you gain pride of understanding and inflate your own enlightenment, glimpsing the wisdom that runs through all things, attaining the way and clarifying the mind, raising an aspiration. This is a weird expression, but escalade the very sky. It's like it's almost like you come up to an escalator that goes all the way to the moon or something like that, right? And he says, you're making the initial partial excursions about the frontiers, but you're still somewhat deficient in the vital way of emancipation. In other words, that's not, doing it that way is not really it, right? And then he says, okay, so there's the Buddha and Bodhidharma both practiced diligently for 6 years and 9 years and so on. And he said, since they did it, doesn't it make sense that we should have to do it, this practice, right? So, he's essentially trying to hint at the solution to this, what looks like a fundamental contradiction in Mahayana Buddhism, right? Everybody's a Buddha, and we're all running around screwing it up, right? And his point is, he basically says, just stop studying and sit, right? And then eventually you'll figure it out. That's kind of what he says, right? And then the document I've been reading, going through after, for the last, well, let's see, this is my 5th session now, I think. Is that right? Yeah. It's actually supposed to be the 6th, but nobody was here, and the recording messed up last time, or the live stream messed up last time. So this is the material I would have covered last week. But anyway, the Bendowa that I've been reading for the last 4 sessions or so is a longer form explanation of this, basically, and he holds up in it a particular kind of practice called self-receiving and employing samadhi, which basically means that you sit there and study as intimately as possible the actual activity of the self, right? And in the course of that study, the presentation of the self opens up to the point where it becomes clear that your conventional cognitive faculty is not the only thing that's going on in your body and mind, basically. And so anyway, that's what he says, right? And so the last time I didn't totally finish the Fukanzo Zengi, but I got down to where he presented most of the material, right? And let's be clear, when he wrote this, he'd been exiled from Kyoto by the Tendai establishment, the existing Buddhist establishment, and he was off living on somebody's dime at a country temple on Lake Biwa, and he decided he needed to write some stuff in order to get started with making his stamp on the world. And he was like, what, 27 at this point or something like that. And he wrote this, the Fukanzo Zengi, but he also wrote this longer form one. And both of them are are documents that he kind of, got a piece of paper and sat down and he wrote. But he frames the Bendowa, the one I've been reading for the last 4 weeks, as kind of a long form Dharma talk, right? And followed by questions, right? Which is sort of what you'd expect if you were giving a talk in a Buddhist temple and in front of a bunch of monks. They'd want to ask some questions after you gave a talk. So, and in those questions, he sort of answers all of the questions and criticisms that he was presented with from the Buddhist establishment in Kyoto when he came back from China. Right? And so I thought I'd read some of them because they're kind of great, right? So question number 1. Okay, we've now heard that the merit of Zazen is lofty and great, but an ignorant person might be doubtful and say, hey, there are many gates for Buddha Dharma. Why do you recommend Zazen exclusively, right? And that is a direct reference to the essentially the main vow you take as a Mahayana Buddhist, right? The third phrase in the Bodhisattva vow, it's a 4 line, 4 stanza, short 4 stanza poem, says, Dharma gates are boundless. This is the Zen Center translation. I vow to enter them, right? And if you look at boundless, it isn't actually boundless in this. Usually in boundless in English, sort of denotes bigness, right? The characters in the original are more like no measurement, right? So of any sort. So they're immeasurable, they're immeasurably small and they're immeasurably large, right? So the general understanding is every moment in the general Mahayana understanding is that every moment is a gate that we can walk through and meet directly and be awake, right? Which so this actually is quite a clever question. He said the guy is saying, okay, so there's infinitely many gates, right? Why is Zazen the one? And so Dogen's pretty briefly says, because it's the front gate. And so the questioner goes on, he says, well, okay, why is it the front gate? And then he gives a slightly longer answer. He says, the Buddha transmitted this way, this method of attaining the way. It's a method, right? And all of the Buddhas ever from the ancient past all the way through the future also attain the way, and the present also attain the way practicing Zazen, and that's why, right? And so the questioner is not super satisfied with that either, and so they say something more pointed. So we understand that you studied the path of the Buddha ancestors and authentically transmit their excellent art, right? In other words, this art of practice, right? This is beyond the reach of ordinary thought. Yeah, exactly. It kind of is, right? But he says, however, studying sutras, reading sutras, and chanting, and essentially liturgical chanting, he says chanting Buddha's name, which is a particular liturgical act that the Tendai school that Dogen used to be a part of and was now trying to break out of does. They just chant the name of Amida Buddha continuously, right? Must be causes and conditions of enlightenment. How can Zazen, just sitting uselessly doing nothing, be dependent upon for attaining enlightenment? Okay, so and then Dogen really just sort of loses it. He says, if you think that the samadhi of all Buddhas, their unsurpassable great art, is just sitting uselessly doing nothing, you malign the great vehicle, which is to say the Mahayana, right? Such misunderstanding is like saying that there's no water when you're in the middle of the ocean. Just now, all Buddhists sit serenely at ease in receptive samadhi, this particular kind of samadhi that we were talking about earlier. Is this not the actualization of vast merit? What a pity that your eye is not yet open, that your mind is still intoxicated. So he just kind of lays it on, right? And then he says, and he says a bunch more sort of, I have to say, pretty insulting stuff. You know, when I first studied this document, the Bendowa, it was with Blanche Hartman, who's the late Blanche Hartman, who was at the time was the abbess of San Francisco Zen Center, and one of her senior students who went on to, I think, move to sort of the Amherst area in Massachusetts and set up a Zen temple. But her name was Ila Gutierrez Baldachin, I think. And when we got to this portion of the Bendowa, she was like, you know, ooh, wow, this is great for the entire document. I mean, when we started reading this stuff, she was like, wow, all of a sudden I really hate this guy. he's kind of a cranky, you know, slightly vituperative guy, right? So, but he goes on and he says, when genuine trust arises, practice and study with a teacher. If it does not, wait a while. It's regrettable that you've not received the beneficence of the Buddha Dharma. And then he goes on to talking about studying and chanting, right? And he says things like, people who chant all the time are like frogs croaking day and night in the spring fields. Their effort will be of no use whatsoever. And somebody asked about this earlier, right? Dogen is laying it on pretty thick here because he's trying to establish this notion that that Zazen is the front gate, right? But it's interesting because even he in the Fukanza Zengi says, you know, in surveying the past, we find that transcendence of both unenlightenment and enlightenment and dying, while either sitting or standing, have all depended entirely on the strength of Zazen. But he also says this thing, which is interesting. He says, in addition, the bringing about of enlightenment by the opportunity provided by a finger, a banner, a needle, or a mallet, and the effecting of realization with the aid of a hosu, a fist, a staff, or a shout, cannot be fully understood by discriminative thinking. And he goes on, right? So those are all direct references to the koan literature in which people are startled out of their human reverie and woken up a bit by being, well, let's see, what does he say? A finger, banner, needle, or mallet. There's a case where this guy named Drew D, I think, was awakened when his teacher, he was about to say something and his teacher just held up his finger, right? And all of a sudden he was like, oh, I see, right? He had a moment of sort of poetic surprise, and his mind turned sufficiently inside out that he saw what was going on, at least briefly, right? And so thereafter, the only technique he ever used was somebody would ask him a question and he'd hold up his finger, supposedly, right? Presumably, if somebody said, you know, which way is the dining hall, teacher, he would probably point rather than holding it up. But so that's an example from the from the literature. This is a banner, a needle, or a mallet. The banner thing it has to do with, and the banner and the needle both have to do with this Indian ancestor that's part of the sort of the chain of teachers that the Zen school cooked up to explain why it's okay that they're practicing Buddhism in China, right? There's a scene in the life of this guy Kanadeva where his teacher Nagarjuna hands him a silver bowl full of water, because he's like, hey, you look thirsty, here, have a bowl full of water. And Kanadeva pulls out a needle. He must have, I don't know, had a needle in his garment or something. Maybe he was fixing it or something. He drops it in the bowl and he hands it back, right? And so now it's this thing where it's like right, if you drink the water, there's a good chance you're going to swallow a needle, right? And there was this kind of moment of significance in which Nagarjuna realized that Kanadeva should be his successor, right? Or needle or a mallet, and he says then the realization with the effect of a hosu, a fist, a staff, or a shout. So a hosu is a whisk. It's a teaching kind of indicator, like when a Zen teacher sits down for a really serious ceremony, they often have a whisk, right? And they use it in this particular way. They wave it around. And once the same woman, Blanche Hartman, we were doing a Q&A ceremony, exactly like the one that Dogen is sort of faking here. And I asked this really sort of impertinent question. She leaped out of her seat and whacked me with a whisk, right? So basically what he's saying is that there's lots of, he's agreeing that there's infinitely many gates that you can go through, right? It can just be somebody handing you a bowl with a silver bowl with water and a needle in it, right? Or you can just be holding up a finger, right? And so the fact that he's being disparaging about chanting, I think he knew this. I think he was just trying to get everybody to listen, right? But it turns out actually that you can completely have startling experiences in the middle of chanting, right? Where all of a sudden the meaning of what you're saying, or just the sound and rhythm and so on and so forth, has this really sort of startling effect, right? Or when we chant the Diamond Sutra, it's at Zen Center. It's not really, we don't really chant it. Basically, we hand out these special books that have the Diamond Sutra in them, and everybody just picks up the book, opens it to a total random place, and starts reading in regular voice, right? And so there's all these people that just like murmur, and every now and again a phrase will jump out. And I had the experience of it being like kind of hair-raising and marvelous, right? It's like it has this powerful effect, right? So, and like I said, I think he understands this. He's just trying to break this guy out of his habitual way of thinking about it. But it's not that you have to give up any of this stuff, right? It's more like use the front gate and then watch what happens, basically, right? Let's see. Okay, so what time is it? Yeah, so I'll read one more question because it's significant and relates to what we were talking about earlier, and then maybe we'll have time to talk about it a little bit. But he says, the questioner says, well, it's clear that those who have not yet realized Buddha Dharma should practice Zazen and attain realization. Again, the questioner has kind of missed the point, right? For those who have already understood the Buddha's correct teaching, what should they expect from Zazen? And this is him going off again. He goes, although we should not talk about dreams with careless people, nor give a boat pole to a woodcutter, right? So in other words, like you're going down to pull your boat around and do some fishing, right? You have a 15-foot pole, right? And you have there's a guy who's going out to cut some firewood and to sell it, and you say, "Can you hold this for me for a minute?" Right? And you know, there's the joke is you'll never see your boat pole again because he'll be like, "Oh, I'll cut it up into pieces," right? Nevertheless, I will give you instruction about this. Then he says this straight out, and we don't need to read the whole answer, but he says, to suppose that practice and realization are not one is a view of those outside the way. In the Buddha Dharma, they're inseparable. Because practice within realization occurs at the moment of practice, the practice of beginner's mind is itself the entire original realization.
See, there it is. Now, see, there's the thing that, I mean,
Yeah.
Bodhidharma stared at the wall, you know, in abject poverty in a cave
For 9 years, right?
And yet he states this,
Yeah.
which is what's kind of, you know,
Right.
there you are.
Right, exactly. It's he talks about this a little bit earlier on in the Bendowa. He says, you're fully endowed with this stuff, but you don't realize it without practice, and you can't really embody it without realization. That's what he says, and so that's why Bodhidharma stared at a wall for 9 years, because he had a whole bunch of presumably fixed ideas about stuff to get rid of before his Buddha nature could bloom or something like that, right? And he also had to sit you've read all this stuff presumably. He supposedly sat until his legs fell off, and he sat until he got so angry with his eyelids for closing that he ripped them off and threw them on the ground, and a tea plant sprouted where each one had fallen, which clearly just means he was caffeinating in order to keep sitting for 9 years, right?
He also said, I sat there until I could hear the ants screaming.
Yes. Yeah, that is totally great, right? Yeah. The Hakuin says something similar. He says, when you're like this, you can see the whiskers on an ant, which is great. Yeah, I think it's the central question, and it can seem like a paradox. The reason it's not a paradox, right, is because we're not like Vigor in Star Trek, right? Like, are you familiar with that Star Trek episode? What? Sorry?
No, it is an episode as well.
Yeah, it's an original Star Trek episode, and it was also in the movie, right? Yeah. So Vigor is this being. It started out as the Voyager probe, and then it met some gigantic thing, this gigantic AI floating around in space, and they somehow merged. And now Vigor is this really, really smart but kind of mentally ill satellite that goes around trying to erase imperfection, right? And in the process is wiping out whole planets and all the rest of that sort of thing, right? And Kirk manages to get rid of Vigor by engaging in a debate with Vigor, in which he forces Vigor to make a little mistake, and he says, "Look, you made a mistake." And Peter's like, oh my God, I made a mistake. I'm freaking out. And at that point, he says, transport him about a light year out into space. And when Peter gets out there and like detonates and makes this gigantic explosion, and that's the sort of key point in the episode, right, or something like that. But the point is that we're not like that. We can be full of dualistic picking and choosing in one moment, and the next moment let it go completely, right? And the practice of zazen is intended to be an enactment of that, and over time you sort of grow into it. Basically, that's kind of the way, right? So again, it's not, and Bodhidharma did the extreme version, and the Buddha did a pretty extreme version too, right? It can take a while, right? But the main point is that you don't have to, that all of the grasping, comparing, etc. that you do in the process is not really helping. So he actually says something. He says, yeah, the practice of beginner's mind is itself the entire original realization. In other words, you don't have to be a beginner. You just have to have this mind that's open and unloaded, right? And then it turns out that you're awake, basically, right? It becomes clear that you're awake. Let's put it that way, right? And his point is, it's not just in zazen, right? That in order to have this thing really be useful at all, you kind of have to, it has to be sort of continuous in your daily life, right? So the mind that you literally practice in zazen, you bring it along with you, basically.
Question.
Yeah, of course.
Do any of these earlier teachers talk about presence, like trying to simply be present? That's something maybe I've heard in more contemporary New Age thinking, but do they ever lay it out in that term?
It's a great question. I mean, in some ways, his notion of receptive samadhi is kind of like radical presence, right? You're present with, as much as possible, the actual experience of the self and the world arising together, right? And so they don't talk about it in terms of presence, and I think both presence, I mean, so the Buddha in the Pali Canon talks a lot about mindfulness, which is talks about in the something that's translated, generally speaking, as mindfulness. It's I think it's sati in Sanskrit, right? But in China, they don't talk about it in those terms quite so much, because that can be misinterpreted as meaning you're a disinterested observer, right? And the idea is not to be a disinterested observer. The idea is to be a full-on participant and be with it, right? And the slippery part of that is that initially it's hard to be aware and be a full-on participant at the same time, because your mind tends to want to draw your attention, right? And the broader attention to body, breath, the contents of your senses and so on and so forth is obscured by that. But over time, that actually softens up. That's been my experience with it, right? Anyway, but yeah, it's a great way to ask about it and talk about it, and it is kind of the central and seemingly paradoxical kind of question, basically. Yeah. I guess I might have time for, and maybe I don't have any time for anything. Well, thank you really a lot. It was total fun. I enjoyed it really a lot. So thanks a lot. Yeah. Yeah, of course. If I'd had the time, there's another question where somebody says, should only monks do this stuff, or